today's economic update for our Patreon community. I want to talk briefly about the decision by the Trump administration to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. I'm not going to talk about the dimensions that have been covered in the press, as Republicans and Democrats have both criticized the president, talked about betrayal of our Kurdish allies, and so on. I want to talk about a different dimension, which in terms of the long-run conditions of capitalism around the world is much more serious and much more important. Kurdistan, Turkey, Russia, Syria. These are all countries close to Europe. What goes on there is of immediate concern to Europe. The refugees now living in Turkey are threatening to invade, to use the language of Mr. Trump, Europe. Europe has a long-standing set of concerns, certainly about Turkey, certainly about Russia, and to a secondary degree about Kurdistan, Syria, and so on. Yet, President Macron of France said publicly that he learned about the United States decision from Twitter. What does it mean that the United States did not consult, did not work together, did not inform, did not plan with Europe something as dramatic as a rearrangement of the Middle East that has been and is of greater concern to Europe than it ever was to the United States? The answer is that the United States no longer relates to the Europeans as allies, fellow countries committed to the capitalist economic system. Mr. Trump is busy cutting alliances that used to exist between the United States and much of Latin America, between the United States and much of Asia, and now we see the cutting of the links with Europe. Mr. Trump's notion of America first seems to be a transition from the neoliberalism, from the globalism that we had the last 30 to 40 years, from the 1970s to Mr. Trump's presidency, and now to make a transition to what we should call neo-protectionism. Fortress America, first economic, then political, and then military. Capitalism blew up into major destructive world wars in the 20th century that led people to be so horrified by the death and destruction of these wars of competing capitalist countries that enormous efforts were made, first after World War I with something called the League of Nations, then after World War II again with something called the United Nations, NATO, and a whole lot of other associations, unifications. Europe itself is a project driven by the hope to avoid the competitive struggles among nations that ended up with the world's greatest self-destructive wars. What we see in that decision to go it alone, to cut a deal with Russia and Turkey that leaves the Europeans as mere spectators, sends a message to the Europeans that they better get their act together, that they better cut deals with the Russians, the Turks, but why stop there? The Indians, the Chinese, you get the picture. Icing out the United States before the United States ices them out of such deals. Russia and Europe could make very good arrangements at the expense of the United States. China and Europe could do it. Let's not forget, Europe taken together is a larger and richer economic unit than the United States. Is it a future of a return to competitive capitalism on the national scale? Will the damage and the inequality and the instability of capitalism that we see inside so many countries now become the harbinger of once again global competition, turning inward, protection in each place, leading up to, as it has so often, global conflict. It should be on the table as a problem. It should be open. It should be debated. Working people and governments should be part of all of that, not secret arrangements made alone in Washington with the rest of the world told to take it or leave it. The cost eventually to the United States and to capitalism here lies in the balance. For those of you who don't remember, let me remind you. At the end of the great competition between Britain, Germany, and the United States and Japan that ended in World War I, the largest country on earth withdrew from world capitalism. It was called the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was joined by the People's Republic of China, by half of Eastern Europe. You get the picture. The cataclysmic wars of capitalism are not only unbelievably destructive of life and property, they also weaken capitalism. And they prepare a way out of this system, even if that's not the intention of the people making these decisions, fracturing these alliances, and setting the world economic and political system down paths we will, I fear, come to regret very much. Thank you very much to our Patreon community for your ongoing support.